Alrighty, hello everyone, and welcome back to our Java course. So today we will be moving on to lesson 6, and so in case you don't remember what happened in the last class, we can go ahead and go over that right now. So let's go over to the file. Here it is. Alright, so last class we kind of went over the basics of if statements. So first of all, we went through the idea of our regular ifs, right? And then we went ahead and we started to review, starting with the if else. And then we jumped into the else if, which is kind of like, a conditional if statement, right? If only this fails, then we get into this, right? And so on and so forth. And then we explore the idea of nested if statements. And, it's kind of similar to these kind of ifs, else ifs right here, in the way that, it'll only reach this else if this if statement fails, then it won't reach this part. It's a little bit confusing if you don't program it yourself, so that's why I'm saying that the best way to learn this kind of stuff is to actually just go into your own IDE and program this yourself. Yeah, that's pretty much just the best way. And finally, we introduced the idea of conditionals. So conditionals, it's like the or, and it's also the and statement. And it's pretty self-explanatory. If both these conditions are met, then it can go ahead and complete this action. And if we put these two lines here, right, it means or, and or means, if either one of these conditions is true, then this will print out. So nothing here is too complicated. And now we're going to go ahead and we're going to start a new file, because we are exploring a kind of a newish concept that we haven't talked about before. So when we come here, let's create a new file, and we'll call it for loops, because that's going to, actually no, we'll just call it loops. Alright, and we create this new file. So in loops, we are going to first of all have to go over and copy our main method, and this is what the main method looks like. Alright, oops. Thankfully NetBeans does this for us, right? And now we're we're going to start going ahead and talking about how in the world are we going to manipulate loops. Alright, how are we going to, when we go ahead and we do something, sometimes we want to do it more than once. And what I mean by that is, say we have an integer, and it's, say, x, and we're going to set it to equal to 5. Alright, and we also want a sum, and we want it to be equal to some number. And say I want to add x to sum 5 times. Now we can do that two ways. We can say sum is equal to x plus x plus x plus x plus x. Oops, plus x. Or we can do sum is equal to x, and then we can do sum plus or equals x 5 times, right? Which is, both are quite, laborious and inefficient, and you're like, wait, but this barely took any time, right? Well, what happens instead of 5 times, I want to do it 100 times. I don't want to be here typing out 100 x plus x's, right? Instead, we came up with something called loops. And the basic idea of loops is, I hope it's self-explanatory, because it's kind of like you go through a certain action multiple times, and you just keep on going through it until a certain condition is met. Alright? So I want you guys to just kind of make sure you think about what in the world a loop is, and meanwhile I'm going to go through our basic types of loops. So our basic loops are known as while and for loops. I need to call this while and for loops. Alright, and while loops are essentially while a condition is true, this will continue to repeat forever. And I'll show you an example of that. In this case, we are going to change this into while sum, and we're going to say while sum, whoops, is less than, let's put some weird number, right? Important to not forget your parentheses. And it is not a colon, it is going to be brackets. Alright, while sum is less than 248, we will continue to add x to it. Alright, and you're like, wait, you introduced this, a couple seconds ago, I'm not sure what this is. Well, essentially means while sum is equal to x plus while sum. It's essentially just adding the value of x to while sum. Likewise, you want to subtract it, you just turn this into a minus. But for now, we want to add it, so we are going to be sticking with plus or equals. Alright, so now we can go ahead and we want to print out while sum. Right? We want to see, did this in fact work out? So we can go ahead and run our program. And we can see that it worked. And you're probably like, hold up. You're saying it worked, but 250 is greater than 248. Well, this is where we have to, think a bit practically. All right, so we are going to change this into just 8. So we can go into a bit of a simpler kind of circumstance, and you will see that it prints out 10. And you're probably a little confused. You're like, wait, it says less than 8, but it prints out 10 here. The reasoning for that is because the first time we go through the loop, while sum is less than 8. So it goes, alright, I'm going to let you through, and it adds 5 to it. So now while sum is 5. Well, 5 is still less than 8. So at this point, we can do 5 plus 5, right? While sum is 5, and x is 5. So we get the value of 10. And now that 10 is greater than 8, it won't accept while sum anymore, so it breaks the loop. Meaning that your end printing value doesn't necessarily have to be less than whatever this cat value is right here. As a matter of fact, most of the time it won't. It will either be greater than or equal to, right? Now, what do I mean by breaking a loop? Well, breaking a loop is a terminology meaning that the loop stops, right? The idea of a loop means that it kind of just repeats forever. Well, when you break a loop, you stop it from repeating, right? So that's the premise of breaking a loop. So I'm going to give you guys about 2 minutes to just soak in whatever I just said on this while loop here. And once you do that, then I'm going to go ahead and move on to our for loops. So 2 minutes for this. Alright, so hopefully that was enough time to soak in what I just said. And now we're going to go ahead and move on to our for loops. Alright, so now we're going to go ahead and we're going to define a new variable. This variable is going to be called for sum. And like while sum, it is going to be the sum for our for loop here. So we're going to write basic syntax where it's for I is equal to 0, I is less than 10, I plus plus. And you're like, oh my, you just, defined a lot of things, right? And you do have to define this before. Let's just format this correctly. And we're going to do the same thing, and we're going to say for some plus or equal x. Alright, and now we're going to see how in the world does this work. And, oops, we forgot to print it out. That is unfortunate. There we go. And let's run. And we can see it prints out 50, and we're like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Does it say less than 10? Yes, well, it does say less than 10. And that is because I is a different variable from x, as you can see, right? What's happening is essentially we're defining three things. Our first is our incrementing variable. All right, so this is a variable that we create specifically for the purpose of iterating, meaning that our second condition is the cap, right? So this is our starting point, this is our ending point, and this is how we're going to be moving from our start to our end. And plus plus in this case just means that I is essentially plus or equals 1, or we add 1 to the value of I. So every single time we go ahead and we write this out, it's saying for I equals 0 to I is less than 10, increment I by 1. And while we increment, we perform whatever action is here. In this case, we go through 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. And this is going to be 10 values, meaning that this is essentially 10 plus 5, or 10 times 5, sorry. Right? We're repeating through this action 10 times. Therefore, we get a value of 50. So a for loop is slightly more hard to grasp than a while loop. So I'm going to go through a couple examples of both of them just so you get a little more comfortable with them. But for now, this is pretty much what you need to understand. I'm going to, again, give you guys 1 or 2 minutes to understand how in the world a for loop works before we go over some more examples. Alright, so hopefully this was enough time for you guys to grasp it. Maybe it wasn't, and if it wasn't, then feel free to just go back and take some more time to make sure you understand what's going on. But I'm not going to be going over any new material. I'm simply going to be going over the concepts that we just went through. Alright, so we're going to start out with another example, alright? And, you know, sum is probably the most common thing that you're going to be using loops for. It could be a sum of words, it could be a sum of strings, really anything. All right. In this case, we are going to instead of doing a sum, we're going to be doing product, and we are going to need new variables, and we're going to call this int y is equal to 3 and int while product is equal to 0. That won't work actually. 1. Alright, and while product is less than random number, we'll make it a little bit smaller so you guys kind of know what's going on. And now we're going to say while product is equal to while product times y. And essentially every single time while product will be multiplied by y. So 1 times 3, 3 times 3, 9 times 3, 27 times 3, 81 times 3, etc. Right? And now we're going to go ahead and print out our while product. Just like that. And now we can go ahead and run it, and we can see what number that we get. And we get 243. And 243 is in fact one of the powers of 3, meaning that this did work. Alright, now, hopefully this isn't too complicated. All that we kind of just went over, all that we kind of just did right here, is essentially we follow the same exact concept up here with the sum, and we change it to product. So we defined our increment right here, y, and our increment in this case is going to be 3. Meaning that every single time we run through the loop, we multiply this previous number by 3. Now, we go ahead and we start out with our base product, right? We can't make it 0 because 0 times anything is still 0. So we make it 1 so that we can continuously go up from 3, 9, 27, 81, 243, and keeps going, right? Now, in our while loop, we set while is less than 237, meaning that as long as it's under 237, we can multiply it by 1 more time, right? So, you know, if in this case we had 81, right, we can multiply by 3 and we get 243. But 243 is greater than 237, meaning that we cannot continue, right? And every single time we just simply multiply by our multiple. Alright, so hopefully that one wasn't too confusing, and now we can go ahead and go into our for loop for this. And we're going to call it for product, and it's going to be 1 as well to start off with, and we're going to start writing our loop. So this time we're going to be calling it I is equal to 0 again, and I is going to be less than, say, 7. And we're going to add 1 to I every single time. Now we are going to write out for product is equal to for product times y. And we want to print out for product at the very end. And we can run, and we can see 2187. If you plug that into your calculator, that is going to represent 3 to the 7th, sorry. Alright, and you know, just to kind of go over, our starting is 0, our ending is less than 7. And we are incrementing by 1, so we go through 1, 2, we want to start with 0. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, right? Which is 7 values. Right? It's a little hard at first to get used to it because you start at 0 normally. Yeah, you typically don't want to start at 1 because everything in computer languages kind of starts at 0. Your index, memory space, you know, basically everything numerical. So it's not smart to just, you know, start at 1, right? Just trying to get used to 0. And, you know, it loops through it 7 times, and we multiply by 3 each of those 7 times until we get our product. Alright, so, there is nothing else really to for loops. And I'm just going to give you guys another minute or two to kind of soak this up before I move on to slightly more complicated concepts. Which will kind of go back to our if statements, by the way. Alright, hopefully that was long enough for you guys to make sure you really understand the concept. And now we're going to move on to a concept known as scope. Alright, scope is a it's a decently complicated topic. It's not too bad really, so you won't find it too hard. So we're going to call this variable because scope has to do with variables. Alright, and we want our main method in here again. So, what is a scope? Right. Well, if you think about a scope in, just English terms, it means, just kind of like a brief, kind of like area of things, right? It's very general, the definition. In this case, in programming rather, the definition of a scope means that it's the place where a variable is applicable. And you're like, wait, what does that mean, right? What does it mean? Where is this variable applicable, right? Well, what I mean is essentially when you define it in certain spots, it can only be accessed in certain parts of the program, and that part of the program where the variable can be accessed is known as the scope. So I'm going to go over a basic example first, and we're going to start off with our integer x, and it's going to be 0 for now. And we are going to go ahead and we're going to say if, we're just going to say if true, so it's always true. Then, oops, we do not want to do a colon. Then we want to print out x. Alright, and we can see that it does in fact print out x. And you're like, what's so impressive about this, right? Well, we defined it outside of this if statement, yet when we called it inside of this if statement, it was still able to call it. But if we do it the other way around, say we define another variable inside this if statement like y, and we try and print it outside of the if statements like this, then suddenly we are going to run into an error. And it's going to say, what in the world? Build failure, right? It can't recognize what y is, right? It's underlined as red because our IDE right here is telling us you did something wrong, right? And also over here, we have another yellow underline, a bit harder to see. And I think if you fiddle around with the settings over here, you can make this black. You can like invert the colors essentially so you can see this yellow underline a little bit better. But it is yellow underlined and highlighted. So when you go ahead and you hover over it, it'll tell you, oh, y is never red. And you're like, what does y is never red mean, right? That doesn't quite make sense. I read the variable. Well, it means the program never called y. You defined a variable y and you set the value as 0, but from that point you never used y again. And you're like, wait, I just called y right here. Well, that's because the scope of the variable is only inside of this if statement. So if I were to move this print inside, right, just copy and paste it in, and we run this file, we can see that it works perfectly fine, right? And that is the introduction of scope. And scope of a variable is one of the most annoying things when it comes to programming, because you have to really keep track of where in the world you define your variables, right? If you define it outside of a loop, you can't use it inside of a loop, right? If I'm to go ahead and define, say, z, actually, you know what? We're just gonna say we're gonna say while, we're gonna create a new variable, a is less than 10. Oh, are we? No, wait, we aren't. I think we need to find this outside here. And we have an extra bracket. Alright. So int a is equal to 0, right? And while a is less than 10, a plus plus, and we're gonna say system dot out dot print line, and we're going to print x. And we're going to see it prints a total of 12 times, 2 right here and 10 for here. Alright, you can count this if you want. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Alright, and we can see, okay, it can access it inside this for loop. Well, if I go ahead and I define int z inside of here, and I try and print out z outside of our loop right here, we are going to get, we are going to get an error. Right, and once again, our z has this yellow underline, our z right here has this red underline, and it tells us exactly what the problem is. And many times it's hard to like trace it back, especially when you remember like, oh wait, I defined z somewhere, right? Why is it giving me this error? Well, the reason behind why it's giving you this error is entirely because you know, you did not define it inside the right scope, and it's one of the most common programming errors that you will bump into. So as soon as we go ahead and say we move z out of our while loop, and we do that, and we run our file, we can see that it prints out z just fine, right? No error. Now I want you guys to kind of think over this concept for a second, and then I'm going to go over our final learning point for this class. Alrighty, so now we're going to go over a final concept, which is going to be defining aside, right? So you'll notice that z is defined outside here, but if we are to mutate the value, say we're going to do z++, alright, and we run this file, we will see that z, in fact, you know, prints out 10. Meaning that our scope, the most formal definition from what we can understand here, is that it can only be accessed on the level in which it was defined. And the easiest way to identify this, or rather, this is actually wrong. The lowest level that a variable can be called is the level in which it was identified. And you're like, what in the world is a level, right? Well, you'll notice that there's indents here, right? All these indents indicate a level. This is going to be the lowest level, second lowest, third lowest, fourth lowest, right? And this is also the fourth lowest, but these two levels are different from each other, right? This is like 4A, this is 4B, right? I don't know what you call it, it doesn't really matter, right? Just know that these two, they're not interchangeable, right? You can't call Y inside here. Now, you can modify, you can change, you can call, whatever, right? You just have to define it at the lowest level in which you are going to call it again, right? So if you know that I'm only going to call it inside this for loop here, then you only need to define it inside this for loop, or while loop, sorry, right? So you'll notice that this is exactly what we used in loops right here. We printed it out and we defined it here, but we went ahead and we called it inside this loop right here, right? So we already basically used this concept of scope without really thinking about the concept, right? And to be honest, it's quite self-explanatory, but it does get a little bit getting used to, and we will talk about more important aspects of it later. But for now, that's all I have for this class. So if you have any questions, feel free to email us. And if not, I will see you guys next week. Thank you.